primary election coming up. No matter what side you're on, Republican, Democrat, whatever, you know, when the history of the United States is that one of our most important rights is to be able to vote. Well, okay, we vote, but then what about, does our vote count, right? And that's what we're really thinking of here. So we're going to have like analysis tonight by Brent as to, for us, particularly in San Francisco, what's going on with voting and, you know, the technical side. And then the action side, we're going to talk about how to register 100,000 people to vote before June 7th. Well, actually before May 23rd. That's the deadline for voter registration. And I also have some poll worker applications, because one of the things it's always nice to do is actually be at the polls to see what's going on. So if anybody's interested in that, we have that. So we're kind of dividing the whole evening into those two segments, the machines and the technical analysis, and then the action. What do we do to get millions of people to vote? Are you ready?
Ready when you are.
All right, my good sir. Brent, you've all read from the flyers that we sent and emails that we sent. His history, I've known Brent since 2008, and it's, you know, really important to have our votes count. So take it away.
Thank you, Shirley, and thanks for inviting me. And for the record, my name is Brent Turner. I'm currently the chair of the elections for the California State Democratic Party Disabilities Caucus, and I work with a group, California Association of Voting Officials, that is focused on the technology issues surrounding voting. The beginning of the story, I guess you could say, happened for me in 2000 when we had the hanging chads occur. And of course it became apparent to the citizens of the United States and the world that there was a problem regarding obtaining a proper, concise vote count. That came and went with the Supreme Court intervention, and we saw the results of that. And then in 2004, we had the Help America Vote Act come in, which basically gave $4.5 billion to the electronic voting machine vendors as we moved away from the hanging chad paper ballot systems. Now, the Help America Vote Act was ostensibly put forward to protect the disabilities community. Whether or not they were successful in that endeavor is another long source of conversation, but the short version is that $4.5 billion with a B dollars went to just a few companies, a handful of companies, some notorious like Diebold, ES&S, and some others that have basically sold deficient voting systems to the country. And now we're in a position here in California where we're looking to buy currently another round of voting systems, as the country is sitting on the systems that were sold at that time, and now they're at their end of life. So basically, we have now a window in front of us to provide solution to what many have deemed a crisis, in that these particular voting systems operate on what's called intellectual property software code, privatized software code that belongs to the companies that make the machines and run on a Microsoft platform. So the problem with that is, if you go to take a look at the software that's doing the tabulation of the votes, you're prohibited from looking at the software, and it is not subject to subpoena. So currently, one of the California Association of Voting Officials board members, Beth Clarkson, Professor Clarkson, is attempting in Kansas to take a look at the code of the systems, and she's being denied that availability of the code. We know this, and this has been a consistent theme. So going back to 2004, when we saw Bush v. Kerry and issues with the vote counts again, but this time based on the electronic vote counts, we immediately started requesting to see the code, the software code that was tendering the counts. And upon denial, it became apparent that there was a great need for a transparency in the systems that did not exist. So my personal story is I went looking to find out the causation and the solution. And what I found was there was activist groups on the left. I happen to be a Democrat, although it's a nonpartisan issue. There were activist groups that were tendering solution, but the solution that they were tendering was actually in the form of hand counting paper ballots. So what they were interested in at that time was the solution of abolishing all the technology. Well, that sounded pretty good at first blush, but upon further inspection, I realized that that was a political non-starter and not a good action for numerous reasons. There's a volume issue in places like Los Angeles and other issues where hand counting would be less than acceptable to the county itself because of the volume of voters in a county. So I ran into a group at that time called Open Voting Consortium, and what they had devised as solution was a system that dispensed a paper ballot, which was good for two reasons. One was it was simple for the voter, and you didn't have to take a pen to the paper, which causes errant markings, which is another form of disenfranchisement, because if the person tabulating the vote can't recognize the voter intent, that's the time where it gets thrown back to the Supreme Court and you have problems. What the Open Voting Consortium system was you would go to the poll, you would press carry, and a perfectly printed ballot would come out with carry plainly printed and a barcode on the bottom. And this, for tabulation purposes, would be ideal. All of it, the entire system, being open source software. One thing to mention, when we talk about open source, we talk about general public license open source software, because that's the high road for open source, the most ubiquitous license available. And the idea being you want as many eyes on the code as possible. Now, some have said that open source is no panacea. A very famous professor from Stanford by the name of David Dill, when testifying in front of Congress, made mention that open source is no panacea. And that was taken to heart by Congress, but it confused them because they interpreted that to mean that open source was not a necessary component of a proper voting system. In fact, since we are in the electronic age, open source is a necessary component of a proper voting system. You should never have corporate secrets prohibiting proper oversight of the election system software. So to my finding, and I think now it is stipulated, that the best system is a conjunction of a paper ballot system that runs on open source software. So the voter experience is they press, to make it simplistic, they press Kucinich, a perfectly printed ballot is dispensed that says Kucinich. It's tabulated with open source software at the precinct previous to transportation. Once you send it off in a van, well, you have another issue with the chain of custody, because as Bev Harris and others from Black Box Voting have shown, there's very many ways to manipulate a paper ballot system. So you have to have checks and balances and redundancy within the system. That being said, no system is ever 100% secure. So there are red herring people that will tender objections to even the best system. But the question is, where do we want to go? If we want to be up on a security level of 8, this is the system that we have advocated. And right now, this type of system currently gained traction in New Hampshire and was utilized in the primary there. However, the rest of the country is still operating on proprietary, intellectual property protected, closed source systems that operate on Microsoft platforms. So we have this dilemma in the United States right now where the country is conducting elections on systems that even Deborah Bowen's past Secretary of State Deborah Bowen's top to bottom review concluded are inappropriate for use as they are insecure. And this is what we are using currently. Now, we don't, as election system analysts and activists, necessarily focus on finding a smoking gun where somebody has perpetrated fraud, because that's very difficult to do, especially since you can get in and out of these systems without leaving fingerprints. They actually have a erasing capability to them. So finding that fraud is most difficult. But the fact that they are available for manipulation is in itself, in our opinion, enough that these systems should be removed from the election system process completely and replaced with open source paper ballot systems. I mentioned New Hampshire to you. I want to make sure that I'm clear. Only the front end, the user interface of the New Hampshire system was actually open source. They're still using a secret corporate-owned software system. I believe it's Dominion for the back end, the most important part, which is the tabulation side. What we're advocating right now in San Francisco County, which is showing a pioneering spirit, interestingly, through the Board of Supervisors, and one supervisor in particular, Scott Wiener, has championed the idea of open source and having San Francisco County basically pioneer this system for the state of California, in that currently Secretary of State Padilla is advocating for a $450 million line item in the Governor Brown's budget to say, we'll take $450 million, plow it into a new batch of voting systems. So right now, it's a race for us to get San Francisco up to speed so that we can show the governor this is the proper way to go if you want to save a couple $100 million for the state right now on this first round of purchases, and heighten the security of the systems, not only in San Francisco and California, but set precedent for the United States and the world. We have an opportunity right now to follow the science, adhere to scientific principles, get the proprietary code out of the systems, and utilize open source, and have a very simple, secure system that saves the taxpayers a lot of money. So that's kind of where we are. I'll just take a few minutes and give you, before I ask you for questions, I'd be pleased to answer, a little bit of the history. There's a certification process that occurs with these systems, and back in 2000, 2005, we started noticing the issues around the certification process, that the labs that they were using for that process were suspect, in that they only get paid if they pass a system through and basically give a system a license to be in the stream of commerce. So based upon that, a fellow that also worked with black box voting by the name of Jim March, he and I took on the role back in those early days of going to all the district attorneys around the state of California and saying, this is basically consumer fraud. These systems don't work for the use that they were sold as intended, and we should attack on that principle. Well, that didn't take any traction, didn't get any traction. So we just kept working, basically, not Jim, but a fellow by the name of Alan Decker, again from Open Voting Consortium, kept working on the prototypes, and he demonstrated in 2004 a simple system that I mentioned to you that was highlighted by the New York Times. Well, the system, the availability of the solution has been there. What has prohibited us from moving forward and getting these systems into use is the political will. I ran into Craig Newmark from Craigslist, and unfortunately he wasn't more helpful, which irritated me, but he did say something to me that I realized was profound in its simplicity. He said to me at that time, "What you lack is political will." In 2007, I had the opportunity to brief then Senator Obama on this issue, and I've continued to brief him over the years with this issue, and good Congresswoman Anna Eshoo has been our advocate in making sure we were in direct relationship with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, as well as other members of the intelligence community. So needless to say, there has been a briefing that's occurred on this issue. Speaker Pelosi, others, they're very aware of this issue and the security issues around the current voting systems. So it's not as though they are not in the know from the top to the county administrators, because the county administrators are really the ones that are hands-on with these systems and understand that they're the ones that do the purchasing of these systems. In order to create the political will, it was like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. We had to go from the top to the White House, all the way through the state, the senators, the legislators, down to the county administrators who are hands-on with these systems. Well, there's a bit of a block there, and there's blocks because of the Microsoft lobbyists and the intellectual property lobbyists that don't want open source highlighted as solution to security problems, because A, open source is free, so the costs are reduced greatly. When you use the kind of system we talk about, it is about 50% cost savings, and that pokes a big hole in their business routine of selling high-priced systems to the government. So they don't need the spotlight on open source to say, if this solves the election system crisis, what else can it do? Well, crossing the aisle, we had the good fortune to work with Congressman Darrell Issa, and he brought open source, he's Republican, brought open source into the United States House of Representatives. So now they are implementing open source systems for their computers. President Obama has called out for open source contracts to be considered by the United States government. So it's gaining traction, and open source is also used in the grand majority of the supercomputers throughout the world, and is inside the governments of many other countries. The United States is lagging behind. I attribute this to the intellectual property lobbyist effort that has log-jammed this situation. But by talking about it and advocating strenuously, we think now we are turning a corner, and there is the opportunity for San Francisco County to lead the state and the entire country in accomplishing this goal. Now, maybe I'm naive and maybe I'm just wishful thinking, but I believe that to be true. And right now, as of a couple weeks ago, COIT, which is the Committee on Information Technology, gave us the thumbs up in San Francisco County for a $300,000 startup monies that will allow us to basically do show and tell, explain to the county that this is not rocket science for the techies that are willing to go to work for this project, that we can prove it up very quickly and move forward, get a system certified by the Secretary of State, and then that system can be utilized by all the counties in the state that want to participate, and then that blueprint will go across the country, because we know that all the jurisdictions are in the same predicament. They're all sitting on crappy voting systems that are at the end of their life. So basically, in a nutshell, that's the story of how we got here, where we are, and in my opinion, where we should be going. So with that, I will ask if you might have any questions for me that I can answer, hopefully, and please.
Does the voting software ever interface with any other non-proprietary software?
Does the
It interface with any other software, or is it just all by, you know?
currently
Currently.
we are seeing that in New Hampshire. So there's open source software being utilized on the front end, but proprietary on the back end. My layperson's perspective and understanding of that is, if you have a grain of proprietary anywhere in the system, the soup is spoiled. So you want a complete open source system front to back. If you start inserting things, now that raises an interesting point. Wise guys have now figured out that if you call a system open source or a software open source and can technically get it to qualify as open source by getting it licensed through Open Source Initiative, that you can sell it to the government and that it's trending. So part of the work of the National Association of Voting Officials and the California Association of Voting Officials is to inoculate the government, the White House, the creators of what's called the White House Playbook, the people at the congressional caucus on the federal level, against that sort of sleight of hand tactic, because we've come this far to get open source ready for deployment in the election systems. We certainly don't want a nuanced open source to take hold that has control points in the hands of corporations, because that's a slippery slope back to where we've already been. So what we're looking for is purity in the setting of having general public license open source, off-the-shelf commodity hardware, and good design and good surrounding protocols, so that you have a very modern, clean, simple system. There is a tendency on behalf of the scientific community to overcomplicate the system, and in that it gets away from common understanding, and that is a danger too. So what we advocate is a very simple system that can be used, and of course it has to have very strong disabilities components, as that is a major factor in what systems are purchased by the jurisdictions. So there's a lot of moving parts here. It is a bit of a task to get them all to line up so that you can make this change. And of course, it's a fairly dramatic change, moving from what they have been doing, the status quo, to what they should be doing, especially since the clerks themselves have an interesting situation. They have business leagues where they get together and have events, basically parties, with the vendors and with Microsoft, and that is done in a business as usual fashion, where the vendors provide free things, even drinks and libations and junkets, to the clerks, who are very friendly with the vendors, because of course they've been doing business together for years, and breaking that apart has its own issue. So we're very aware of all these little pieces, and I think there is hope that we can get somewhere, especially since we're seeing, as Shirley mentioned, the disenfranchisement issues that are now being unveiled. There's enough spotlight coming into the equation that people are, especially as we're in this election cycle, becoming aware, like, now tell me again how the votes are counted, and you know, the issues that we've seen just in the lead up, in my opinion, will cause a chain of events so that people will hopefully follow it down the line to say, well, what happens after my vote is cast? How is it counted? And I think when people find out that there is no way to tell how your vote is counted because the software is a corporate secret, that it will hit the fan and will gain some more traction. But so far, it's been a little bit lonely of a feeling because this really hasn't been in the spotlight as much as it should be.
Could you describe the two machines in use in San Francisco in terms of the criteria that you think are optimal?
Where we're going or where we are now?
The machines that are currently in use.
Currently, we're using a system that is very regular to the state. It's one of we have just a few vendors in the state, and as you know, when you vote, I believe you connect the dots, and so that is the stray marking issue. So that creates a very high rejection rate, and what a lot of people don't know about the San Francisco ballot is that a large percentage of those are actually remade at the department. So you vote on a ballot, but then that's not the ballot that's counted. Actually, that ballot is remade by a worker bee that takes the ballot, sits there, maybe with or without oversight, and remarks a new ballot that then is counted. So under that circumstance, you would vote, your ballot would be remade, then that ballot would be inserted into a tabulation system that creates the count. Now that can be in some counties done at the precinct level or at a central tabulator. The central tabulation process is a whole nother issue. And again, that's operating on a corporate-owned software that is not subject to inspection